before the shopping cart, before the checkout line, before anyone thought to hand a woman a wire basket and say, "Go on, pick it yourself." Southern grocery shopping meant standing at a counter and pointing. In 1916, a store in Memphis changed that forever. And for the next 50 years, what filled that basket wasn't chosen by an algorithm or a corporate buyer in another state. It was chosen by her mama's brands, her Milltown's brands. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. They didn't invent Southern taste. They bought it, and then they buried it. Number 25. Sunshine Crispy Saltines, a tin-lined box that kept the humidity of a Delta summer from turning every cracker soft before the 5th of the month. 5 cents in the early 1920s, 10 cents by the worst years of the Depression, and still the cheapest thing, standing between a family and an empty cupboard. Crumbled into pot liquor until the broth thickened. Crushed over cold buttermilk for a supper that cost next to nothing and filled a stomach anyway. Split down the middle and buttered thin, folded into a handkerchief, and sent off with a child who had nothing else for lunch and never once complained. This was not a snack. This was a foundation sold in a box with a price stamped right on the front where everyone could see it. Number 24. Snowdrift Vegetable Shortening Savannah, Georgia. Cottonseed oil pressed and whitened into a can that sat next to the stove in nearly every Southern kitchen by the mid-1920s. Crisco owned the shelves north of the Mason-Dixon line. Snowdrift owned the shelves south of it, and no Southern grandmother would be talked out. Of which one made a biscuit rise higher? 15 cents a can during the Depression, and a single can lasted a family of 6 through a month of biscuits, pie crusts, and fried chicken on Sunday. There was no science behind the loyalty, no taste test, no study. There was only the fact that her mother used it, and her mother's biscuits never failed. Number 23. Alaga Cane Syrup, Montgomery, Alabama, a jug of syrup boiled down from sugar cane, sold for a dime when sorghum ran twice that, and real maple syrup wasn't even a thought in a Depression-era kitchen. In the Black Belt counties of Alabama and Mississippi through the 1930s, a dime jug of Alaga could be made to stretch 2 full weeks, poured thin over a biscuit on a Monday, poured thick over the last of the cornbread on a Friday when there was nothing else left to eat with it. Grandma just called it syrup. She never called it what it actually was, the only sweetness a family could count on. Number 22. Trappies, Louisiana Hot Sauce New Iberia, Louisiana. Bottled by a Cajun family since the 1890s and sold for a dime a bottle by the 1930s, when a dime still meant something in South Louisiana. A few drops turned a bowl of plain rice and beans into a meal a working man would actually look forward to at the end of a 12-hour day in the cane fields. It sat on the table like it had earned its place there because it had. Long before hot sauce became a national obsession, with 100 brands fighting for shelf space, Trappies was already doing the one thing that mattered, making a poor man's plate taste like somebody in that kitchen cared. Number 21, Blue Plate, Mayonnaise New Orleans, 1929. Born the same year the stock market collapsed, and it managed to outlive nearly every bank that failed that October. Made with real eggs and cottonseed oil in a plant on the edge of the French Quarter, sold in a jar with a plain blue label because there wasn't money in a Depression-era kitchen for fancy packaging, and nobody was buying it for the label anyway. A dime a jar in the early 1930s. What it bought was the difference between a meal that felt like nothing and one that felt like somebody had tried. Stale bread became a sandwich worth eating. A can of tuna, split 6 ways, became a lunch instead of a disappointment. Blue Plate didn't advertise on the idea of luxury. There wasn't a luxury market to sell to in New Orleans in 1932. It advertised on the idea of care, and Southern women who couldn't afford much else could always afford a dime for that. This was not condiment. This was how a mother said she noticed you, without having the words or the money, to say it any other way. Number 20. Martha White Self-Rising Cornmeal, Nashville, Tennessee, 1899. The leavening was already mixed in, baking powder and salt, measured once at the mill instead of measured every single morning by a woman who was already awake before the sun, feeding 6 children before she'd eaten a bite herself. 15 cents a bag in the 1930s, and that 15 cents bought her back minutes she didn't have to spare. Martha White didn't wait for anyone's permission to make a working mother's morning easier. It just did it, quietly, in 1899, while national brands were still selling plain cornmeal and calling that enough. Today we call it stone-ground artisan cornmeal. Put it in a paper sack with a farm's name printed across the front in a serif font, and charge $9 for the privilege of pretending we invented the idea of convenience. That is not progress. That is a markup on a shortcut her own exhausted mornings invented for free, sold back to her grandchildren at 60 times the price, marketed as heritage instead of what it actually was. Number 19. Cheerwine Salisbury, North Carolina. Born in 1917 out of a wartime sugar shortage that should have killed it before it started. A cherry soda, deep red, bottled by a family that refused every buyout offer for 100 years. In the Carolina Piedmont, Cheerwine sat in the Piggly Wiggly cooler next to the national brands and outsold them on nothing but stubbornness. It wasn't cheaper. It wasn't better advertised. It was just theirs. There's a particular kind of loyalty that doesn't show up in a marketing report. The kind where a family keeps buying a regional soda for 3 generations because their grandmother did, because the taste is tied to a porch, a summer, a person who isn't here anymore. That is not brand recognition. That is memory with a price tag on it, and it is the one thing the national chains could never manufacture, no matter how many focus groups they ran. Number 18. Community Coffee, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1919. Cap Siraj started it as a single counter in his father's grocery store, grinding coffee beans fresh to order because that was the only way he knew to sell coffee that didn't taste like it had sat in a warehouse for 6 months. No wholesaler between the roaster and the customer. No middleman taking a cut. Just a red tin, dark-roasted beans, and a promise that what was inside had been ground the same week it left the store. By the 1930s, that single counter had grown into a full plant, and the red tin had made it onto Piggly Wiggly shelves across South Louisiana. Still family-run, still roasted the exact same way Cap Siraj had done it by hand. A pound cost around 30 cents during the worst years of the Depression. Not the cheapest coffee on the shelf, but the one that got reused. Grounds brewed once, then brewed again the next morning, weaker but still coffee, because nothing in that kitchen got thrown away while it still had something left to give. Nothing wasted. That was the rule long before anyone put a name on it. Number 17. Louisiana Coffee and Chicory, New Orleans, 1902. Though the chicory itself goes back further than the company does. During the Civil War, the Union blockade cut New Orleans off from coffee entirely, and cooks in the city started roasting and grinding chicory root to stretch what little coffee they had left. It was bitter. It was strange. It worked. By the time Louisiana started selling the blend commercially in 1902, what had been a wartime desperation measure had become something the city was proud of. Not a shortage anymore. A recipe, kept on purpose for decades after the reason for it had disappeared. A dime a can by the 1930s, brewed dark enough to stand a spoon upright in the pot, poured over chicory-scalded milk for children. Too young for straight coffee, but old enough to want what the adults were having. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Some of what gets sold today as regional flavor started as nothing more than a city refusing to go without. New Orleans didn't lose the war on coffee. It just found a way to keep drinking through it and never let go of the taste that got them there. Number 16, Nabs. Charlotte, North Carolina, 1913. peanut butter pressed thin between two crackers and wrapped in wax paper that crinkled in a lunch pail, sold for a nickel straight off delivery trucks that rolled up to the mill gates before the morning shift because a mill worker didn't have time to walk to a store and back on a 15-minute break. That nickel bought protein, salt, and enough calories to make it to quitting time. Lance built an entire company on that nickel. This was not a snack food. This was fuel, engineered for people the food industry never bothered marketing to directly, because it didn't need to. The mill whistle did the marketing for them. Number 15. Bama Jelly Gadsden, Alabama, 1910. A jar of grape or apple jelly for a dime, at a time when a pound of real butter ran 50 cents and was nowhere near guaranteed to be in the icebox on a given week. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Half of what got called a treat in a Depression-era kitchen was really just arithmetic done quietly, so a child never had to know how close to nothing the family actually had. A biscuit with Bama on it tasted like a gift. It was really a decision, jelly instead of butter, because jelly stretched further and cost less, and a child eating breakfast has no way of knowing the difference between abundance and a mother doing math in her head while she spread it thin enough to make the jar last the month. Bama wasn't dessert, no matter how it tasted going down. It was the difference between a breakfast a child would eat without being told to and one they'd push around the plate. And in a house with 6 mouths to feed, that difference mattered more than anyone outside that kitchen ever understood. Number 14. White Lily Fleur Knoxville, Tennessee, 1883. Milled from soft red winter wheat, grown in the hill country of Tennessee and Kentucky. A lower protein wheat than the hard red varieties milled up north into brands like Gold Medal and Pillsbury. Lower protein meant less gluten. Less gluten meant a biscuit that shattered into flaky layers under a fork instead of chewing back like bread dough. Food scientists would eventually explain exactly why a White Lily biscuit rises the way it does and a northern all-purpose flour biscuit never quite manages it. Something about protein percentage, something about how the gluten network forms in the dough. Grandma never read a single word of that. She just knew, every morning for 40 years, that White Lily made a biscuit rise like it meant something, and every time she was forced to substitute a national brand during a shortage, the biscuits came out flat, and she knew exactly why, even without the vocabulary to explain it. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and it took a laboratory decades to catch up to what was sitting in her flour bin the whole time. Number 13. Grappico Soda, Birmingham, Alabama, 1917. A grape soda the color of a bruise, bottled a few miles from the cotton mills that drank it. A nickel a bottle. In the textile towns of the 1920s and 30s, Grappico wasn't a treat you saved for Sunday. It was what a mill worker bought on a Friday with whatever was left after rent, cold enough to make the whole week feel finished. The bottling plant employed local men. The syrup formula stayed a Birmingham secret for decades. That is not a small thing in a region where so much manufacturing left and never came back. National soda companies had trucks running through the South by the 1930s, flooding shelves, undercutting price. Grappico held on anyway, on loyalty alone, in a way Coca-Cola's board never had to understand because they never had to earn it the same way. Grandma just called it the grape soda. She didn't know, or care, that it had survived things bigger brands hadn't even had to fight. Number 12. Golden Flake Potato Chips, Birmingham, Alabama, 1923. Cooked in small batches in copper kettles and carried store to store in the back of a Model T before the company owned a single delivery truck of its own. Hand-salted while still hot, sold for a nickel, a bag out of tin bins set right by the Piggly Wiggly register, where a child with an extra nickel in their pocket could make their own decision for the first time in their life. In a region where snacking hadn't yet become an industry with a marketing department and a jingle. Golden Flake quietly taught an entire generation of Southern kids what a potato chip was actually supposed to taste like. Thin, sharp with salt, gone before you'd meant to eat the whole bag. Every national brand that rolled into the South after the war, with bigger budgets and louder advertising, was, to a Birmingham child who'd grown up on Golden Flake, the copy, not the original. That is a kind of brand loyalty no amount of national advertising money has ever been able to buy back. Number 11. Jack's Cookies, Chattanooga, Tennessee, vanilla wafer tins stacked on the Piggly Wiggly end cap for a dime a box, thin enough to layer 6 deep into a banana pudding without going soft before the whole family got a bowl. Not a dessert brand, not really. A tool, the same way a good cast-iron skillet was a tool. Every grandmother across 3 or 4 states had her own version of that pudding, her own ratio of vanilla custard to sliced banana to wafer, and every single one of them started with the exact same tin from the exact same company, because there was really only one wafer worth using, and everybody in the South already knew it. This was not dessert. This was engineering, cheap, reliable, built to feed a crowd. It fed 12 people on a Sunday for less than $1 total, and that math doesn't work anymore. And neither does the pudding when somebody tries it with a store-brand wafer instead. Number 10. Zatarain's Crab Boil New Orleans, 1889. A single spice packet, mustard seed, bay leaf, dried peppers, coriander, a whole handful of flavors nobody had ever bothered bottling together before, that turned a pot of plain tap water into the reason a whole extended family showed up on a Sunday afternoon. A dime a packet by the 1930s, dumped whole into a rolling boil with whatever the men of the family had managed to pull out of the bayou or the bay that morning. Crawfish in the spring months, blue crabs through the summer, corn and potatoes, and sometimes sausage thrown in to stretch the pot further on the weeks when the catch had run thin, and there wasn't quite enough to go around on its own. This was not a spice blend sold to make food taste marginally better. This was the difference between a meal eaten alone at a small table and one that filled an entire backyard with newspaper spread across a picnic table. Cousins reaching across each other for the same steaming pile, hand-stained red, nobody in a hurry to be anywhere else. Zatarain's never once advertised itself as a Louisiana institution, never ran a campaign built around heritage or tradition the way brands do now. It didn't need to. Every family that reached for that packet already knew, in the way you know a recipe passed down hand to hand instead of looked up in a magazine, that the packet on the shelf and the Sunday spent in that yard were the same thing entirely, inseparable, one causing the other. No national spice company out of Ohio or New Jersey was ever going to understand why a dime's worth of seasoning mattered enough to build a whole weekend around, and that is exactly why none of them ever managed to replace it. Number 9. Niece's Country Sausage, Greensboro, North Carolina, 1917, sold by the pound and wrapped in plain butcher paper with a length of string tied around it, no plastic window to peek through, no ingredient list printed anywhere. Just a family's word, passed store to store, that what was inside that paper was good. Ground fresh each week, seasoned with sage and black pepper in a recipe the Niece family never sold, never licensed out, never allowed a single corporation to buy the rights to, even as offers came in over the decades that would have made someone in that family very comfortable. A pound cost around a quarter through the hardest years of the Depression and fed a family of 5 at breakfast for 2 full mornings running, the drippings carefully saved afterward and turned into gravy poured over biscuits, so that nothing left that cast-iron pan except the pan itself, wiped clean and set back on the stove for tomorrow. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. A family sausage recipe kept private for over a century is worth more, in the end, than any factory formula a national meat company could ever reverse engineer in a test kitchen. because the thing that made nieces actually good was never written down anywhere a buyer could find it and put a price on it. It lived in a woman's hands in exactly how long she let the sage sit against the pork before she started grinding, in a ratio she never measured because she didn't need to. That is not something a corporate acquisition can put on a label, no matter how many decades it spends trying, and it is exactly why Nieces is still family-owned today, while so many of its Depression-era neighbors got bought, renamed, and quietly discontinued. Number 8. Armour Vienna sausage and potted meat small tin cans stacked deep on Piggly Wiggly shelves in cotton mill villages and coal camps stretched across the South. A nickel a can through the worst years of the Depression. Sometimes less when a store owner wanted the shelf space cleared before the next shipment arrived. No refrigeration required, no ice needed, no trip to a butcher a family might not have the money to pay anyway. Just a can opener and a household that couldn't count on fresh meat showing up on the table more than once a week, if that often. In a coal camp in eastern Kentucky in 1934, a single can of potted meat spread thin across a stack of saltines might be the only real protein a child saw between one Sunday and the next, and nobody in that house treated it as anything less than a proper meal, because in every way that mattered, it was one. Grandma just called it supper, plain and simple, no explanation offered because none was needed. She never called it what it actually was underneath the label. A meat-packing company finding a way to sell working families the protein they otherwise couldn't afford, in a can small enough and cheap enough to hide, gently, just how little there really was to go around. 6 cans bought at once for 30 cents still left change in a mother's hand, and that math, done quietly at the Piggly Wiggly counter week after week, kept children fed through years when a fresh pork chop simply wasn't a guarantee anyone in that town could make. There is a number that never made it into a single Piggly Wiggly advertisement, and it should have. A nickel can of potted meat, the kind selling across the South in 1934, delivered more usable protein per penny than almost any fresh cut of meat a coal camp family could have bought that same week. More than a pork chop, more than stew beef. Dollar for dollar, penny for penny. Nutrition researchers studying Depression-era diets would go on to confirm exactly what those families had already worked out for themselves without a single laboratory test. Canned protein, unglamorous and unphotographed, kept children alive through years when fresh meat simply wasn't something a household could promise itself. Nobody was proud to serve it. Nobody wrote it into a church cookbook or bragged about it to a neighbor. But the math was the math, and the math meant a family with almost nothing left at the end of the week could still put something with real nutritional weight on the table every single night without fail. That is not a small food, and it was never treated as one by the people who depended on it. That is a family doing arithmetic nobody should have had to do at all, quietly, without complaint, and getting their children through it anyway, 1 nickel can at a time. They knew things about stretching a dollar that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember right about the time we finally run out of the conveniences that made stretching feel unnecessary. Number 7. Merita Bread A Southern Regional Bakery Loaf, soft and white, sliced thin and wrapped in wax paper, sold for a dime by the mid-1930s at a time when a great many families still baked their own bread at home, simply because store-bought bread cost money that cornbread never did. Buying a loaf of Merita instead of baking one meant something real in a household's budget, and it meant something socially, too. It meant a family had crossed some invisible line where cornbread wasn't the only bread ever seen on that table anymore, where a child could ask for a proper sandwich instead of a biscuit split and filled, and actually get one without being told there wasn't money for it. Merita bakeries dotted small southern towns clear through the 1930s and into the 40s, and the smell of those ovens running before dawn was, for a great many people who grew up near one, simply the smell of a town that still had something being made locally, by hand, by neighbors who lived 3 streets over. That mattered more than it sounds like it should have. It meant jobs. It meant a bakery truck rolling down Main Street every morning with a driver who knew everyone's name. And it meant, eventually, watching those same small Southern bakeries close their doors one by one through the post-war decades, bought out or simply squeezed out of existence by national bread companies that could undercut a local operation on price without ever having to try particularly hard. This was never just bread. This was a town's ongoing proof that somebody local was still making something worth buying with their own 2 hands. Number 6. Sunbeam Bread, little Miss Sunbeam smiling out from the wrapper. A national bread brand that leaned harder into Southern advertising than almost any competitor through the 1940s and 50s, sponsoring local radio programs and county fairs and church suppers until it felt every bit as local and homegrown as anything actually baked down the road by a family anyone in town could name. A dime a loaf? Then 15 cents by the post-war years, soft white bread that an entire generation of Southern children grew up thinking of as simply bread, full stop, no other word or brand name ever entering their mind as an alternative. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Sunbeam wasn't from anywhere in particular, had no hometown bakery, no local family behind the recipe, no small-town oven anyone could point to and say that's where it started. It was a national company that learned better and faster than almost any competitor in the entire post-war grocery business exactly how to dress itself up convincingly as a hometown brand, and it worked so completely that decades later, plenty of people across Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee would swear up and down that Sunbeam was theirs, born and baked somewhere close by, when the truth underneath all of it was closer to a very well-funded, very well-run marketing campaign that simply got there first and never once let go of the ground it had claimed. Number 5. Sundrop Sodacent, Matthews, South Carolina, 1949. A caffeinated citrus soda bottled specifically with the men working tobacco fields and textile mills in mind, men who needed something considerably stronger than plain sugar water to make it through a full Carolina afternoon without slowing down. More caffeine packed into a bottle than a standard cola of that era carried, and every single person who reached for one at the Crossroads store knew exactly why they were reaching for it. A farmhand pulling tobacco leaves in the thick heat of July didn't need a treat to reward himself with at the end of the day. He needed a jolt to get through the middle of it. Something that would put him back upright for the remaining 5 or 6 hours, still standing between him and quitting time. Sundrop delivered precisely that in a bottle costing a nickel, sold out of an ice chest at a general store that might be the only business for 10 miles in any direction. It never once chased the same customer that Coca-Cola spent millions chasing with national campaigns and celebrity endorsements. It went straight after the man in the field with 30 minutes for lunch and 5.5 hours of work still ahead of him. Unglamorous and unbothered by it, and in doing exactly that, it built a fiercely loyal following across the Carolinas that quietly outlasted a dozen flashier national soda trends that came through with bigger budgets and left again without ever managing to touch it. Number 4. R.C. Cola Columbus, Georgia, 1905, bottled a full 7 years before anyone north of the Mason-Dixon line had so much as heard the name Pepsi, and holding its own ground against Coca-Cola in its own home territory for the better part of a century. A nickel a bottle straight through the Depression, and in a great many small southern towns scattered across Georgia and the Carolinas, R.C. wasn't the second choice sitting quietly next to the real one on a dusty shelf. It was the only choice most weeks, simply because the local bottling plant belonged to RC, and Coca-Cola's delivery trucks hadn't found a reason to make the long drive that far off the main highway yet. This was not some regional knockoff trailing behind a national drink, trying to imitate a formula somebody else had already perfected. This was one of the South's own colas from the very start, built from the ground up by a Georgia pharmacist working with what he had on hand, competing on completely equal footing in its own region for decades before the rest of the country ever quietly decided, without asking anyone in Columbus, that there could only be one true winner in America's soda aisle, and started acting accordingly with shelf space and distribution deals that made competing an uphill fight it never had to be before. Number 3. Moon Pie Chattanooga, Tennessee, 1917, built entirely on a single specific request from a coal miner who told a Chattanooga bakery salesman, plainly and without much ceremony, that he wanted something big, something filling, and something cheap enough that he could reasonably afford to buy one every single working day of the week, without thinking twice about the cost. Something that would fit comfortably between two hands still black with coal dust at the end of a shift, eaten standing up, no plate required. 2 round graham cracker cookies, a thick slab of marshmallow pressed between them, the whole thing dipped in a shell of chocolate, sold for a nickel apiece by the time the 1930s rolled around, and every coal camp commissary in the region had a jar of them sitting by the register. This was not a dessert dreamed up in a boardroom by executives trying to guess what working people might enjoy on a special occasion. This was a food built to exact specification by an actual working man who knew precisely what his own body needed to survive an underground shift, communicated directly and honestly to a company that, remarkably, actually listened to him and built the product around his answer instead of their own assumptions about what he should want. Number 2. The RC and a moon pie, not one food at all, but a ritual. An RC Cola pulled ice cold from a red chest cooler, and a moon pie still soft from that morning's delivery truck, bought together for a dime, eaten together on a mill break or in whatever shade could be found at the end of a long field row, so common across the Depression era and post-war South that people simply started calling it a working man's lunch, without a hint of irony in their voice when they said it. 10 cents bought enough sugar and raw calories to finish out a shift that had already started well before sunup and wouldn't end until well past dark that evening. Nobody wrote that particular pairing down in a cookbook anywhere. Nobody sitting in a corporate office decided RC and moon pie belonged together and then ran an advertising campaign to convince the South it was so. It was invented, independently and repeatedly, by thousands of tired coal miners and cotton pickers and textile mill hands at thousands of different general stores scattered across a dozen states, all arriving at the exact same dime's worth of survival without a single one of them ever comparing notes with the others. The cold cola cut straight through the thick sweetness of the marshmallow. The marshmallow gave the sugar something a worn-out body could actually hold on to past the first hour, instead of a quick spike that faded before lunch break even ended. Somebody, somewhere back in the 1920s, worked that out through nothing more than hunger and plain trial and error, and it spread the only way something that true ever spreads. Mouth to mouth, storefront to storefront, with no marketing budget behind it at all, and no need for one. Number 1. Duke's Mayonnaise, Greenville, South Carolina, 1917, made without a single grain of sugar in the recipe at a time when nearly every other mayonnaise sitting on that same shelf was sweetened deliberately to soften the sharp bite of the vinegar underneath. That one missing ingredient is still, a full century later, the reason arguments break out at Southern dinner tables over which jar rightfully belongs in whose icebox, and neither side has ever once backed down. Eugenia Duke started making it in her own home kitchen in Greenville and selling sandwiches made with it directly to soldiers stationed at a nearby Army training camp during the First World War. No factory behind her yet, no distributor, no advertising department, just one woman with a genuinely good recipe and a base of soldiers hungry enough and far enough from home to actually notice the difference on the first bite. Word of it traveled home with those same men once the war ended, and they scattered back across the South, and by the time Duke's finally reached a proper Piggly Wiggly shelf, it didn't need any kind of introduction at all. It already had a reputation walking in the door well ahead of it. This is the exact kind of brand loyalty that refuses to bend for a coupon, refuses to bend for a sale, refuses to bend even now, when a national brand spends millions of dollars a year trying to convince an entire region otherwise. Ask a family from South Carolina or Georgia or Alabama what they honestly think of a Northern mayonnaise brand. Sitting uninvited in someone's refrigerator, and watch the room go quiet in a way that has nothing whatsoever to do with taste and everything to do with identity, with whose kitchen raised you and whose two hands first taught you what a proper sandwich was actually supposed to taste like before anyone told you otherwise. Closing 25 brands, and every single one of them earned its place on a Piggly Wiggly shelf the only way that mattered back then. A Southern family picking it up, week after week, year after year, because it was theirs, and nobody had to convince them otherwise. A tin of saltines that stood between a family and an empty cupboard. A red can of coffee ground fresh because one man in Baton Rouge refused to let a middleman touch it. A dime jar of mayonnaise with no sugar in it, still splitting families down the middle 100 years later, still meaning something nobody outside the South fully understands. Pour a jug of Alaga over the last of the cornbread. Crack open an RC and a moon pie on a field break the way 1,000 tired men did before you, without a single one of them knowing the others were doing the exact same thing. That is not brand loyalty the way a marketing department writes it up in a quarterly report. That is a region remembering, on purpose, who fed it when nobody else was going to, and one by one the national chains that swallowed the independent grocers swallowed the shelf space right along with them until half these names sit on a bottom row somewhere today, if they're stocked at all, crowded out by a private label copy nobody in that kitchen ever asked for and nobody's grandmother would have recognized as the real thing. They knew things about loyalty that a boardroom will never be able to buy back, no matter how much shelf space it owns now. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother kept in her kitchen, and which one you still can't find anymore. Number 6. Cowboy beans on the Texas plains. A chuck wagon cook in the 1880s and on through the early 1900s had to feed a dozen hungry cowhands with almost nothing that would spoil on a cattle drive. There was no refrigeration, no fresh vegetables past the first week, and no room in the wagon for anything that couldn't survive weeks of jostling under a Texas sun. Beans, simmered for hours in rendered fat and packed for the trail, delivered protein that traveled for weeks without an icebox in sight. They cost about 2 cents a serving, dried beans being about the cheapest calorie a rancher could buy in bulk. A single sack could feed a whole outfit for a month, and it never went bad no matter how long the drive dragged on. The cook would start the pot before dawn, letting it simmer low and slow over the coals, while the men worked cattle from sunup to sundown, so that by the time they rode back into camp, exhausted and covered in trail dust, there was something hot and filling waiting for them. This was the fuel that moved cattle 1,000 miles across open country, from the ranches of South Texas up through Kansas and beyond. Nobody riding drag on a dust-choked trail, breathing in the dirt kicked up by 1,000 hooves, thought of beans as poverty food. They thought of them as the only thing standing between them and an empty stomach at sundown. In a life that offered almost no comfort, a bowl of beans by the campfire was the one certainty a cowhand could count on. Day after day, mile after mile. Number 5. Canned soup base. In the immigrant tenements of northern factory towns in the 1920s, a soup bone bought for almost nothing at the butcher's counter didn't get thrown out after one pot. Families crammed into cramped apartments, working brutal hours in mills and factories, had to make every cent of a meager wage stretch across a week, and meat was the first thing to run short. So the bone got boiled twice, once for the family's dinner, and again the next day for a thinner, still golden stock that got canned and saved for the week a paycheck didn't quite stretch far enough. Nothing wasted. Not the bone, not the marrow, not the last cloudy inch of broth in the pot. Mothers would stand over the stove for hours, coaxing every last bit of flavor and nutrition out of a single piece of meat, because there was no telling when the next one would come. The jars lined up on a shelf or in a cool cellar corner were not decoration. They were a calculation, a hedge against a future they couldn't predict. This was not garbage food. This was a family's insurance policy, sealed in a jar, against a Tuesday when there wasn't enough money to buy meat at all. When the factory cut hours, or a father was laid off without warning, that jar of stock became dinner, thinned with water, thickened with whatever vegetable scraps were left, and served hot to children who never knew how close the cupboard had come to being bare. It was resourcefulness born of necessity, turned into something that kept a family together through the leanest weeks of the year. Number 4. Pickled okra. Deep South and Gulf Coast gardens grew okra faster than any family could eat it fresh through a southern summer, the pods multiplying by the day in the thick, humid heat until a single row could overwhelm a kitchen. Pickling was the answer. Whole pods packed upright in jars with vinegar, dill, and a dried chili for heat. Brine gone faintly cloudy around them as the jars sat curing on a shelf or a porch step. It was free from the garden, costing nothing but the labor of picking, washing, and packing, and it kept a vegetable that would otherwise spoil in 2 days stretched across an entire winter. A family could put up dozens of jars in a single afternoon, working together at the kitchen table while the canner rattled on the stove, and those jars would carry them through months when the garden was bare, and store-bought vegetables were a luxury few could afford. Today, a trendy cocktail bar sells a single jar of pickled okra as a garnish for $9, calling it artisanal, plating it alongside a craft bourbon drink with a handwritten label and a story about heritage. Grandma just called it Tuesday. She pulled a jar down from the shelf without ceremony, sliced it onto a plate next to whatever else was on the table, and never once thought to charge anyone $9 for something that grew wild in her backyard. She was right. Everything she knew was right, and it took nearly a century for anyone to notice. Number 3. Canned apple butter. In Pennsylvania Dutch country and the Appalachian orchards, apple butter wasn't made alone. It was made in a copper kettle over an open fire, stirred for hours by whichever neighbor's arm wasn't tired yet.